In the early hours of March 10, 1945, Tokyo was still asleep when the first American bombers appeared over the city. There were no warning sirens in time, no fighter interception, and no meaningful air defenses waiting for what was coming. What followed was not a conventional bombing raid, but the deliberate ignition of an entire metropolis. Operation Meetinghouse was designed to do something no air attack had ever achieved before at this scale: to break Japan's ability and will to continue the war by destroying its cities from the inside out. Within hours, Tokyo would become a sea of fire. By morning, more than 100,000 civilians would be dead. This single night would kill more people than either Hiroshima or Nagasaki, and it would force Japanese leaders to confront a reality they had tried to deny for years. The war was no longer winnable. By 1945, the United States had reached a strategic conclusion that marked a fundamental shift in modern warfare. Precision bombing against Japanese industry had failed. Factories were dispersed, production was decentralized into homes and small workshops, and Japan's cities were built largely of wood and paper. American planners realized that Japan's true industrial base was not confined to factories, but embedded within its urban population. Under the command of Curtis LeMay, the U.S. Army Air Forces abandoned daylight precision bombing and adopted low-altitude nighttime firebombing. B-29 superfortresses were stripped of defensive guns to carry heavier incendiary loads, flying low enough to ensure accuracy and maximum fire spread. The weapon at the heart of this strategy was napalm, an incendiary specifically developed to burn intensely and cling to surfaces, turning entire neighborhoods into fuel. Operation Meetinghouse was the first full-scale test of this doctrine, aimed at Tokyo's densely packed working-class districts. The scale of the attack was unprecedented. Nearly 280 B-29s dropped over 1,600 tons of incendiaries in carefully planned patterns designed to create a firestorm. Temperatures inside the burning city reached levels high enough to melt asphalt, ignite clothing instantly, and consume oxygen itself. Winds generated by the fires reached hurricane strength, pulling people back into the flames as they tried to escape. Rivers boiled, canals became mass graves. Entire families suffocated in shelters as the heat drew the air from their lungs. Japanese police records and survivor testimony later confirmed that most victims were not killed by explosions, but by fire and asphyxiation. This was not collateral damage, it was the objective. What made Operation Meetinghouse different from previous bombings was not just the death toll, but its psychological effect. For the first time, Japanese civilians and military planners alike saw that there was no defense against American air power. Fighters were ineffective at night. Anti-aircraft fire was useless against low-flying bombers moving in massive formations. Civil defense measures collapsed within minutes. The myth that Japan could absorb punishment indefinitely, that the home islands were inherently defensible, was shattered in a single night. Tokyo was not an isolated case. It was a demonstration. By dawn on March 10th, 16 square miles of Tokyo had been erased. Over 1 million people were homeless. Government ministries continued to function, but the illusion of control was gone. Japanese leaders now faced a grim calculation. If one night could do this to Tokyo, what would happen when dozens of cities were targeted the same way? Operation Meetinghouse was not intended to end the war immediately. It was meant to prove that the United States possessed a weapon and a strategy capable of annihilating Japan city by city, without invasion and without warning. From that night forward, the question in Tokyo was no longer how to win the war, but how much longer Japan could endure what was coming next. The devastation of Tokyo on March 10th was not an isolated decision made in desperation. It was the result of months of analysis, experimentation, and strategic frustration. Throughout 1944, American air planners had attempted to cripple Japan through high-altitude precision bombing, targeting aircraft factories, steel works, and transportation hubs. The results were disappointing. Jet stream winds scattered bombs miles from their targets. Cloud cover obscured aiming points. Even when factories were hit, production often resumed quickly, because Japan's war industry was dispersed into thousands of small workshops embedded in residential neighborhoods. The traditional logic of strategic bombing, refined over Europe, simply did not work over Japan. By late 1944, American commanders concluded that Japan's cities themselves had become the factories. Destroying them meant destroying the war economy at its core. This realization led to a radical shift in doctrine. Instead of aiming at individual industrial targets, American planners began designing attacks to maximize urban destruction. Studies of Japanese construction revealed a vulnerability unlike anything seen in Germany. Entire districts were built from wood, bamboo, and paper. Homes were tightly packed. Fire breaks were minimal. Once ignited, these cities could burn uncontrollably. Napalm-based incendiaries, originally developed for battlefield use, were refined specifically for urban deployment. They were engineered to burst open, scatter burning gel across wide areas, and ignite secondary fires almost instantly. The goal was not simply to start fires, but to create conditions in which fires merged into firestorms, generating their own wind systems and overwhelming all means of escape. Tokyo was chosen not only because it was the capital, but because its working-class neighborhoods represented the heart of Japan's war production. Japanese authorities were not unaware of the threat, but they were unprepared for its scale. Civil defense planning had focused on small-scale fires and limited raids, not citywide infernos. Fire brigades were decentralized and poorly equipped. Shelters were shallow and offered little protection against extreme heat. When the incendiaries began falling, emergency response collapsed almost immediately. Survivors later described a city that ceased to function within minutes. Roads became impassable. Water mains failed. Communication broke down. What followed was not chaos in the abstract, but the systematic failure of every structure meant to protect civilian life. The speed of collapse shocked even those who had warned of vulnerability. For Japan's military leadership, the implications were devastating. The raid demonstrated that American air power had achieved something Japan could neither counter nor deter. Night fighters were ineffective. Radar coverage was limited. Fuel shortages grounded many aircraft before they could even attempt interception. Anti-aircraft fire achieved negligible results. The idea that Japan could impose unacceptable losses on American bombers, as Germany had tried to do, was no longer credible. Operation Meetinghouse exposed a fatal asymmetry. The United States could destroy Japanese cities at will. Japan could not meaningfully respond in kind. In the days following the Tokyo raid, Japanese officials conducted internal assessments that were grimly realistic. Police and municipal reports confirmed casualty figures far exceeding initial estimates. Entire wards had vanished. Millions were displaced. More importantly, the raid forced a re-evaluation of Japan's strategic position. If Tokyo could be erased in a single night, then Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, and dozens of other cities were equally vulnerable. There was no realistic way to defend them all. The home front, long portrayed as resilient and unbreakable, had been exposed as defenseless. The belief that Japan could endure bombing while inflicting decisive losses elsewhere began to erode at the highest levels of government. Operation Meetinghouse marked the moment when the war crossed a psychological threshold. It was no longer about attrition or gradual exhaustion. It was about annihilation at a scale that made continuation increasingly irrational. Japanese leaders did not surrender immediately, but something fundamental changed after March 10th. The future of the war was no longer being debated in terms of victory or honorable stalemate. It was being measured in cities lost, civilians killed, and the shrinking margin between survival and collapse. Tokyo was the proof. What followed would be repetition. In the weeks after the Tokyo firestorm, the United States did not pause to assess its conscience. It expanded the campaign. Operation Meetinghouse had proven that Japanese cities could be destroyed faster and more completely than any industrial target ever could. American planners now treated the March 10th raid as a blueprint rather than an exception. Night after night, waves of B-29s moved across Japan, targeting one urban center after another with the same methodical precision. Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, Yokohama, and dozens of smaller cities followed. By the summer of 1945, 66 Japanese cities had been systematically firebombed. Some were reduced by more than half in a single raid. The scale of destruction was no longer measured in factories disabled, but in square miles erased. For Japanese civilians, the realization was immediate and terrifying. There was no safe city. There was no effective warning system. Raids came at night, when evacuation was hardest and panic spread fastest. Survivors of earlier bombings fled to relatives in the countryside, only to discover that urban refugees were overwhelming rural resources. Food shortages worsened, disease spread. 8.5 million people were left homeless before the war ended. Entire social networks collapsed as families were separated or annihilated. The state continued to broadcast messages of endurance, but daily life told a different story. The empire could no longer protect its people. That fact spread faster than any official announcement ever could. Inside Japan's leadership, the implications were undeniable, even if rarely spoken aloud. Military planners had long argued that the decisive battle would be fought during an American invasion of the home islands. The firebombing campaign undermined that assumption. Cities that were supposed to support mobilization, production, and logistics were being erased before invasion ever began. Industrial output collapsed not because factories were hit directly, but because workers were dead, displaced, or too exhausted to function. Transportation networks broke down as rail yards burned and urban hubs disappeared. The home islands were being hollowed out from within. Even if an invasion never came, Japan was bleeding to death. The psychological impact extended beyond civilians to the armed forces themselves. Soldiers returning from the front found their hometowns gone. Letters stopped arriving because addresses no longer existed. Morale eroded quietly but relentlessly. The belief that suffering would eventually yield victory began to give way to a more dangerous thought, that suffering had become meaningless. This shift mattered deeply. Militaries can endure extraordinary losses if they believe those losses serve a purpose. Operation Meetinghouse and the raids that followed began to strip that belief away. Firebombing did not offer heroic narratives of sacrifice. It offered only annihilation without resistance. By mid-1945, American intelligence assessments recognized the effect. Intercepted communications and post-raid analyses showed a growing awareness within Japan that the war could not be won. The firebombing campaign had achieved something years of blockade and battlefield losses had not. It forced Japan to confront the limits of endurance. Atomic weapons would later dominate historical memory, but by the time Hiroshima and Nagasaki were destroyed, Japan's urban core was already in ruins. More people had died in firestorms than would die in nuclear attacks. More cities had been erased by napalm than by atomic bombs. The realization that the United States could continue this destruction indefinitely was already taking hold. Operation Meetinghouse therefore occupies a unique place in the history of the war. It was not the end, but it was the turning point in perception. It marked the moment when Japan began to understand that defeat was not theoretical or distant, but ongoing and irreversible. The American weapon that changed everything was not just napalm itself, but the strategy behind it. A strategy that transformed cities into targets, civilians into vulnerabilities, and time into the decisive enemy. From March 1945 onward, the war was no longer about whether Japan could stop the United States. It was about how much of Japan would still exist when the war finally ended. By the time Japan began serious internal discussions about ending the war, the damage inflicted by firebombing had already reshaped the country beyond recognition. The cumulative effect of Operation Meetinghouse and the raids that followed was catastrophic. According to post-war assessments by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, roughly 40% of Japan's urban areas had been destroyed before August 1945. Entire cities ceased to function as economic or social systems. Production collapsed not because machinery was targeted, but because the human infrastructure that sustained it had been burned away. Food distribution failed, transportation networks disintegrated, local governments lost the ability to govern. What remained was a nation still armed, but hollowed out at its core. This reality deeply unsettled Japan's civilian leadership. While military hardliners continued to speak of decisive battle and national sacrifice, others recognized that the war was already being lost in a way no battlefield victory could reverse. Firebombing had introduced a form of destruction that bypassed traditional military logic. There was no front line to defend, no counteroffensive to launch, no meaningful way to impose reciprocal damage. The United States did not need to conquer territory to dismantle Japan's capacity to resist. It only needed to continue flying. The implication was devastating. Even without invasion, Japan faced extinction by attrition from the air. Each week the war continued meant another city erased, another population displaced, another irreparable wound. When atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they shocked the world, but within Japan they were understood in a broader context already defined by firebombing. Many Japanese officials later acknowledged that the atomic attacks were not the beginning of defeat, but the confirmation of it. The firebombing campaign had already demonstrated that the United States possessed both the means and the willingness to destroy Japan completely. Nuclear weapons did not introduce the concept of annihilation. They accelerated a process already underway. By August 1945, Japan's leaders faced a stark calculation. Continued resistance would not preserve honor or independence, it would ensure total destruction. Operation Meetinghouse therefore stands as the moment when Japan realized the war was irretrievably lost. Not because of a single raid, but because it revealed a new form of warfare in which endurance itself became impossible. The American weapon that changed everything was not just napalm, nor even the B-29, but the industrial, strategic, and psychological machinery behind them. It was a system capable of erasing a modern society faster than it could adapt or respond. From that night in March onward, Japan's defeat was no longer a matter of if, but of when and how much would be lost before the end came.